That's good.
I've gone ahead and turned the recording on, so we'll wait a couple minutes to start, but
Yeah.
please accept that.
Okay. Yeah, we do want to make this available to people who weren't able to join the call. So it goes to the wider membership as well. And John was very kind in agreeing to that. So that's great. And he's also going to provide his slide deck in PDF form so that that'll be available on the website as well.
Very good.
We'll give it a couple more minutes and then we'll start. Just there were about 13, 14 people who registered, but you never know who turns up at various moments in this in this process.
I always estimate about 60%.
Is that what you do? Yeah.
Yeah, that will actually turn up. It's pretty consistent, I think.
Ah. Okay.
I think we have so many, we look at something, we say, oh, that would be interesting. I'll join that. And then something else comes along that's more interesting. And you say, oh, well,
Okay.
yeah. So it's people clearly sign up for more things than they can do.
But the value of this being a recorded event, as well as John providing the slide deck, is that it asynchronously others can learn from this experience as well. So that's great. Oh, Gloria. Yes. Good stuff. People are trickling in.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's nice to see another female face, Gloria. I thought I was
yes.
alone here.
Nice to meet you, everyone.
Hello, Gloria. Good. Okay. And Gloria, where are you dialing in from today? Gloria? Oops. Oh, you're muted, Gloria. We can't hear. I see. That's what it is. Gloria, where are you located today?
I'm located in Ottawa, Canada.
Oh, good. Yes.
Oh.
Fellow Canadian.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah.
Where are everyone located?
Okay. Well, look.
It's everybody in Canada knows everybody else in Canada, just like everybody in Texas knows everybody else in Texas.
Okay.
By the way, I've put John's slides in the PDF form into the chat box if you wanted to download those now, just to follow along.
Okay, so how about we get started? And because there will be others that will join us probably. But again, I want to give John as much space and time to share his thoughts as possible. So welcome, everybody. I'm Bert Pater, and on behalf of the Roundtable, I want to welcome you to this, which is really our first online webinar workshop as a prelude to the gathering of the global network and the STS Roundtable in Austin, Texas, September 27th to 30th of this year, on the theme of organizing work fit for humans in the digital age. And in relation to that theme, our guest presenter, who it's a real privilege to have joining us, Dr. John Boudreau, is going to explore a framework that he's been developing for a new work operating system based upon the research that he and his colleagues have done to support fluidity and flexibility, both for workers and for organizations. And in this session, John is going to go through the principles that he sees behind this new work operating system, as well as some of its key elements. We are going to have a couple of breakouts for maybe a few minutes, 10 minutes or so. We may not actually break out depending upon our numbers. We may be able to handle it as a large group. So other than saying that John is a longtime friend of the STS design community and knows a number of us like Stu Winby and so forth in our community, John is a professor emeritus in School of Management at the University of Southern California. He's also a senior research scientist with the Center for Effective Organizations. And most of all, I think he's a very prolific author and written a number of books that I highly recommend. Like even before Work Without Jobs, there was Reinventing Jobs, which was a really fine piece of research on a 4-step approach to developing automation at work. So with any further ado, I want to turn this over to you, John. So.
Thanks, Bert.
Yeah.
Everybody looks like I can be heard, and the screen's showing a slide. That
Yes.
looks about right. Okay, Great. Very good. So that's a little bit about me. I'm going to back up one. I didn't put all of this in the chat. So down at the bottom of this slide is lots of ways that you can get in touch with me. I hope you will, reach out on LinkedIn in particular, and you can see my email address and also the website at the bottom if you want to learn more. And there's a Work Without Jobs section there as well. And if you really want to dig into the book, there's a website called www.workwithoutjobs.com with excerpts and stuff like that. So that's the book we'll be talking about today. And as Bert said, we'll draw on ideas from at least one previous book with Ravin that I did called Reinventing Jobs that was about automation and work. And then there's a book even before that called Lead the Work that was about engaging workers in ways that are not necessarily regular full-time employment. And all of that has kind of come to land on the book Work Without Jobs here. So what we'll do, I'm going to do a fairly quick run through of the main ideas about the book. And then, I don't know, probably in about 10 minutes or so, just fair warning, we'll have breakouts. And thanks to Pete for helping with that. And then come back and discuss them. So that's about a 10-minute period. And then we'll cover the ideas in the book in a little more depth, and then another breakout, and then conclusion. So that's the agenda for the next 90 minutes or so. I can't thank you enough for joining me today. I'm so eager. I was delighted when Bert reached out because I haven't really had a chance to explore the organization design, let's say the socio-technical systems aspect of this. And so I'm delighted to have so many of you with us today. And I'm hoping to learn a lot from you, really. So I'll do my humble job of presenting a few ideas. But I must say, I'm just fascinated to hear your examples and understand where you think this might fit or not fit with the work that you know so much about. So this is one of my favorite metaphors for work these days, just to start in on the content, that we could think of work. It's a little bit of an extreme position. And again, I'll be interested in your discussion, but just as a starting point, we could think of work as embedded in an ice cube called a job. And in most HR systems, certainly when you count work, you count the number of jobs and you count job vacancies and job holders. And when economists calculate a shortage or a surplus of workers, they generally use the unit of analysis that's a job. That's how you know if you have a shortage. We count the number of jobs that are likely to exist and the number of people willing to take regular full-time employment in those jobs and qualified for them. And if the supply of people willing to do a full-time job is greater, then that's a surplus. And if it's less, that's a shortage. And I'll give you some examples that I think kind of restate that. What this metaphor is that jobs are melting. The elements of the job are melting so that they're available to maybe reconfigure, refreeze in new ways. We could think of workers as being traditionally thought of as job holders. So they're in an ice cube called job holder, and they move from one ice cube to another. And again, the worker element is melting with the components of a worker being more readily available and more fluid. And then we could also think about learning. And the idea of qualifications, with the extreme case being learning held in an ice cube called a degree. And those degrees are melting as well. And I'll get a bit more into that, but that's my first offering. Is perhaps we think of work more as a fluid set of things that could be reconfigured rather than a set of ice cubes that have to be frozen in the same shape all the time. leaders have choices, and I think this is going to rest a lot on the shoulders of frontline and mid-level leaders, as well as leaders of companies. So there is an HR role in this, and that's certainly the crowd that I work with a lot. And again, I'm very interested in a group like this one, which is a little different from that, to think more about the organization level. And so this is a message that I send pretty loud and clear to leaders and HR leaders. Leaders have choices about how they interact with this new, more fluid work system, ranging from avoiding it completely, denying it. We were just talking about Elon Musk saying, basically, you have a job and that job exists on a site. And if you don't show up on site for your job, we'll assume you have quit. Very wrong. I mean, he's absolutely dead wrong, and I'm not sure quite what his purpose is in saying it. I think there's probably he's a pretty smart guy, so I can't imagine he really believes it. So it's a dead wrong idea that work has to be contained in these containers. And so for leaders, there's the pretty fundamental question about what are the values, principles, frameworks, and decision rules that they're going to use. And today I'll present some ideas about the framework that Ravin and I put together, kind of a humble start to a conversation about that. So I'm going to offer then a set of first principles, and then an idea about how this might evolve. And then we'll go to breakout groups and see what you think just about that to get started. So the principles in the book are designed around these four ideas. One is starting with the work, meaning the elements of the work that exist, let's say, within a job, or that might exist if you had a project worker, tasks, projects, etc. All of you are familiar with that unit of analysis, and so I'll be interested, you can substitute your own word, but you get the idea. We have a job, inside of it things happen. Let's start with that work rather than assuming we have to create a job. Second one is combine humans and automation. That's very much an echo of the Reinventing Jobs book. The idea being that automation doesn't neatly lift and replace people in jobs. A robot or AI doesn't come in and do the job. What it does is part of the tasks or the projects or the elements of a job. And you very often end up still needing the humans combined with automation, now perhaps doing things that are markedly different, maybe very often much more valuable. Consider the full array of human work engagements. We can think of that internally. Lots of experimenting these days with what's been written about, and it was a very interesting article about sort of STS platform-based systems that are emerging. So we can think about a platform for work where people find work through an AI-driven or digitally driven platform. That can happen inside, but of course it can also happen beyond the boundary of the organization, where we might look at a platform for gig workers or project workers, crowdsourcing, even executives, contractors, etc. So consider the full array, principle 3 of work arrangements. Again, at the bottom, I've tried to relate that specifically to this group just to get you talking. And we've got the paper that Bert was kind enough to send that kind of started off this whole discussion about where my work might fit with that. And then finally, again, something you're familiar with, allow the talent to flow to the work. And our proposition is that all of these principles really work better, and some of them don't work at all, if you limit yourself to the world of jobs, job holders, and degrees. They work much better, and you can see many more options if you allow jobs, job holders, and degrees to melt, and allow the components to be free to be matched and recreated. And that's kind of where I think leaders will play in. So this is kind of a summary of that system that I've described. On the left side is sort of the old way. On the right side is the new way. The first row, let's call it work. Instead of looking like jobs, work looks more like tasks and projects. The second row, let's call that workers. The left side, traditionally workers seen as job holders qualifying for a job. And on the right, I think I'll call it capabilities. Skill-based systems are a good start at this. I think skills are probably a little bit of the wrong unit of analysis for what's needed. I prefer capabilities that would be more like what someone can do or desires to do, which would be a combination of knowledge, skills, and ability, and maybe even motivation. And then finally, at the bottom, we might call it learning. And on the left, we have learning as a college degree. You either do or don't have the degree that qualifies you for this job. On the right, we might say the parts of the degree are melted into qualifications, badges, experiences, etc. So if this thing is running full form, it's the right side. And you've got these deconstructed tasks and projects available to match with deconstructed capabilities, which are available to match through qualifications that people can get. Now, we're not going to move to this system, willy-nilly. I mean, this is not tomorrow. We're not going to have zero jobs. And in some ways, the title is a little sensational, but we're not really talking about all work moving out of jobs. What prompted the book was the idea that we'd hear about agility and other things, and people would say the jobs are getting in the way. Automation, the jobs are getting in the way. We're trying to be agile, the jobs get in the way. If we limit ourselves to just saying whose job is it, we really end up without being able to do what we need to do. And so we came up with kind of a summary of some of the things we hear. So on the left is the trigger we describe in the book. Operating challenges, workflows and processes are changing, very unpredictable. That first row, that's one of the opportunities when no one at the moment is going to come to a leader and say, can you please implement that new work operating system that Ravin and John wrote about? I don't know that we'll ever get quite to that point. But they need it, and leaders need it. And one of the clues would be operating challenges. So on the right, there's the quote. We're trying to implement Agile, but things change so fast that no one knows their assignment. We can't write job descriptions fast enough. That's a clue I tell my HR leaders or leaders that you're probably in need of a new work operating system in those spots where that's happening. Same thing in the second row. Supply chain constraints, talent constraints, information, other resources. For example, we have job requisitions open for months. We can't hire enough cybersecurity engineers. Nobody has a degree. Or in some units we have too many, and others we have too few. Again, the idea there is what you need is a new work operating system that doesn't depend on the job requisition or on people doing that job in a certain place. New technology, we talked about that a little bit. The robots, the AI are not neatly lifting people out, and yet my payoff function was based on redeploying certain FTEs with this automation. That's how we said we'd pay for this, is either lay off or redeploy people and count up the salary, say that's what the robot got back for us. Well, it's not happening that way. I need the people to work with the robots and the AI, and it happens at a task level. Again, they're not going to say they need a new work operating system, but that's really what we think is happening here. And then shifting organizational priorities. Pick your priorities: sustainability, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, etc. We're committed to measurable goals in these areas. I've used DEI on the right. But whose job is it? If we say, oh, this is everyone's job, well, that kind of becomes no one's job. Well, one solution to that is to make the elements of those priorities into projects, for example, and allow the system to operate to get work to those projects rather than waiting for a job to emerge or feeling like you have to write a job description. So in a nutshell, I know that was kind of quick. That's what we're talking about. And so at this point, I think you've got an idea of, and again, in this group, some of you are extraordinarily expert at this. So here's a couple of breakout questions that we thought might stimulate your discussion. And you could pick any one of them. You don't have to do all three or whatever combination. How real is this today? I'd be very curious about your own experience. Is this real? Has it been around a long time? Are there examples that you've seen in your work where this notion of melting and reconfiguring might fit? And do you expect to see more of this, or do you expect that we'll see less of this? Are we going to snap back to strictly jobs, as Elon Musk talks about, or go to a completely fluid system, as some of the other tech companies and others are doing? Okay, so with that,
So John, just thinking before we break out, because we got a few moments here.
Sure.
Maybe looking at those 4 principles again, if you can go back to that.
Of course, you bet.
Are there any questions, just to clarify? Because we'll get into the discussion of these, but I just want to make sure that there's real clarity about these, because these principles are very, very key to the system that John's going to be laying out.
And I put the paper from Oz and John
Perfect.
Into the chat if anybody doesn't have access to it.
And I highly recommend that paper. That's a really good one.
Any questions?
Thanks, Oz.
Gloria or Nancy or Pierre or Robert or Trond?
And come with you.
Okay,
Thanks, Nancy.
that's good to hear.
Nancy was saying she's read the work, but it's also valuable to hear the person speak. So I'm feeling a little bit of pressure to make sure I add additional value to her reading. So keep me posted, Nancy, on if
All
I
right.
do that.
Well, your smile alone is helpful.
Oh, that's very kind. That's
Well,
very
what
nice.
I find is helpful that he's bringing the vibe from Santa Fe. So, I mean, that's that in and of itself counts for something.
Thanks.
Okay,
You know,
well,
one
perhaps
of
we
the
are
things.
ready.
One,
Yes,
one of the-
Robert's got his hand up.
oh, go
Yeah.
ahead. Ray.
Thank you, Bert. John, I think I'm with you on the principles and the things you've explained so far, but even still, I've got a question from the Netherlands. Is there an underlying assumption in your work or view on these four principles on the stability of the actual function of the organization or the actual stability of the work itself? Because it seems to me like you're taking artifacts of tasks and projects, something relatively stable. What's your take on that? And then especially, of course, in the light of innovation and technology driven affordances, etc.
Well, I would say, and again, so great question, Robert. Thank you very much. I think the system we're talking about is designed to both acknowledge and probably also promote. We might call it instability in one way, so I think it's a very good question. I think we will see workers, leaders, et cetera, need to get accustomed to the idea that they just won't have the kind of stability they did before, particularly if you say that stability is in the form of a relatively fixed system of jobs and reporting relationships and hierarchies, et cetera. Not to say that it doesn't change, but I think Bert and I talked about before this, I think what we envision is something Chris Worley, Stu Winby, Sue, and others have written about. This idea of perpetual change probably means that we need something more fluid than jobs to make that happen. So is change always completely perpetual? Probably not. There's probably going to be many arenas in which a traditional stable job system, job holder degree, probably going to work fine. It's at those trigger points, I think, Robert, where we say, well, in my view, it's already unstable. Automation has made it unstable. Striving for agility and perpetual change has made it unstable. New work arrangements and new priorities, all those four principles, okay, I think they sort of already create instability or the need to move to something less stable. And perhaps this new work operating system, in this case, Ravin and my focus is, of course, very much on the work and the worker. And I think this group can think about the organization that surrounds it. So I would say, yes, probably instability is what we're talking about here, but not chaos, but an instability that in the sense that we need to allow the melting and reconfiguration of jobs and job holders that we used to think were pretty stable. Is that helpful?
Yes, very. Thank you.
One of the things that I've found very interesting is the emergence of the agile approach, which of course started with software design primarily, but now seems to be spreading across broad ranges of the organization. I had a conversation last night with a colleague who is a senior human resource person, and she is working on a project where they're working to bring agile into the human resource function of the organization. And they're basically using many of the things that were outlined in the Agile Manifesto, many years ago. And she said that she's finding it a little bit unsettling for herself, having been raised in a more traditional HR environment. But she says it's also liberating because it's helping her to rethink what it means to deliver value to the client from the client's point of view, rather than from her bureaucratic human resource point of view. So I found that conversation yesterday to be fascinating, and it seems to fit with what you're talking about here with the ice cube metaphor.
Absolutely, Bert. Yeah.
So-
In
so,
fact, yep. Go ahead, Peter.
Maybe we should go
Or
back
me,
to the
Bert. We'll come
breakout
back.
groups, those questions, John.
Sure,
Okay.
absolutely. Here
So
we go.
Pete, we have 8 or 9 of us on the call. Maybe we stay as a large group, do you think, or not?
Yeah.
Yeah, let's try it.
Yeah, okay.
The questions are in
So
the chat.
We plan for no more than about 10 minutes, 12 minutes for this. So it will be very brief, but Pete was starting to get us into this. The first question is, well, in your experience, how real is this new work operating system today? Any comments on that? Trond or Pierre or anybody? How real?
It's real. So it's that's if I'm talking from Norway and looking at it, it's about the metaphors using here is you force you look upon some kind of total meltdown. It's not a total meltdown. It's kind of reconfiguration, and then you have the organizations who I believe, as Robert emphasized earlier, that the organization as such is important. I don't know if what's like in the US at the moment, but in Norway we have unions, for instance, setting up, and that's kind of hampering flexibility because they will keep for the positions and jobs. So it's yes, it's happening, but it's some structures that are slowing down the process, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
It is, but on the other hand, it's kind of when moving, you have some structures left that you are working within, helping you out to take the steps. So it's a bit yes, thank you both, so to speak. It's you need some of the structures, and as well you need the meltdown, so to reorganize and reconfigure it.
Okay. Other comments on how real it is in terms of what you're experiencing? Pierre or?
Yeah, Bert, I think it's real, but not for every job, not for everyone. There are also jobs who are doing the same for 100 years, and they're still doing it for 20 years, but also jobs are changing very fast. For instance, a guy working in a garage, he's now putting your car through the electronic analyzers.
Yeah.
And the computer analyze your car. And now he's changing to electric cars. And that's really a different job as 5 years before. But the people on the airplanes, and when the airplanes start, who are working with the bags, which is a problem everywhere now in the whole world, they do the same thing. So I think we're going to two worlds. One of the worlds is changing very fast, and one world who is staying the same for a few years. It will be changing, but I think it will take some 10, maybe 15 years.
Yeah.
Okay.
Other thoughts? Anybody else?
The only thing I would like to see is that the universities takes this in. That will be nice to see. So it's because if you have cemented organizations, it's in the universities,
right,
and they need to do something. I don't know, but that's up to the academics here.
Yeah, I would just thought, like from my experience, Peter, I don't know, Peter, do you want to, from your perspective? I was going to add something to what Pierre said, but I want to wait until somebody else.
I'm not hopeful that the universities will move very quickly, given my association with several of them in the recent past. When I was teaching a couple of years ago, when the pandemic hit, and overnight we went from face-to-face learning to online learning, and the hierarchy of our university said, okay, so now you have to go home and use Zoom to record lectures and do all your classes. So we hope you have a laptop computer, and we hope you have some software and so forth, but do a really good job, because you don't want to embarrass the university. And but we ended up, I mean, it was almost literally that bad, but then we ended up having a once a week all faculty meeting on Zoom to discuss the problems we were having.
Yeah.
But it was just a hugely problematic thing. Then the other aspect was that the parents of the students were up in arms, because they had paid to send their children to a very expensive university, and now their children were in the bedroom at home doing their, and the parents were not happy about it. So why are you charging us so much tuition when they're in the bedroom on a computer? And so it's the university that I was working at was very glad to get back to face-to-face classes, and I thought it was very funny, because there's none of the ice cube thing going on that John's talking about. We were not coping well with the refreezing of the ice cube in a different form.
Yeah, my answer to John's question is that, and this relates to your comment, Trond, about the university, is that although I think people are kind of wandering into this new operating system, most don't have the concept of a new framework. And this is where the educational system can support more explicit understanding of what's required to make this new work process function. In my experience, the reality of this really, and this relates to also your comment, I think, Robert, about stability or instability, because where I find it showing up is where the work is very unstable. It's changing all the time. So, for example, and a lot of this was provoked by the whole COVID experience of remote work. But anyway, I would say accounting folks I work with, in terms of their work, it's quite stable for the most part. But then when I go and work with my IT friends, it's incredibly unstable. And they are working constantly on different projects, constantly. And they have to have a much more fluid way of organizing. Engineering folks I work with, it's a mix. There's a lot of instability, a lot of changing of the work required. I mean, there's new capital projects, there's new technology coming in that they have to adapt to. And what's very interesting, when you get the mix of these different experiences of work within the same organization. For example, the engineers I'm referring to were virtually demanding the ability to hire people external to the organization to help them with a task, and the organization refusing to let them hire and not have people on site. But they actually won out, the engineers did, because the work had to be done.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying about my experience of this mix occurring in the current reality, from my experience anyway. But one last question before we move on with John. To what extent do you think we're going to see more of this happening, regardless?
May I ask you one question first, Bert?
Yes.
It's about your experience. If you look at these engineering companies, did the personnel do different tasks?
Yes.
They obviously did different tasks, but did they went into different areas of working? If they were mechanical engineers, they went into different projects, doing kind of mechanical engineering in all projects. So that's, for me, it's not, that's okay, they are a bit flexible. That's the traditional way of working. They will move around in the different projects, but still they will do the mechanical engineering. And if you look at what John was emphasizing, that was, removing the mechanical engineer boundaries, so to speak, moving them and adjusting, taking in other disciplines. That's another way of looking at it. So I don't know if you have seen that.
Yeah, I have, but what I've seen more in the engineering side is where the work that we would say a mechanical engineer does is different.
Yep.
It's different. And
Yes.
so they're actually doing different kinds of work. Some of it is actually located much more in the cloud than it was in the past. And so they don't do that work anymore, other work. And because this operating system or the way they're handling the work process is still not quite the framework that John's going to share with us, they do tend to hang on to some of the old labels.
But still,
Oh,
isn't that if you're in the cloud or whatever, it's about the different tools.
Yes.
You're using different tools to do the same work. That's my point. The point is to reconfigure what kind of the new type of engineers are, and that's what the meltdown of John is. My understanding, at least, about what he's talking about, because then you are totally reconfiguring, and that's about. And you can do the same. Take the same issue with the agile computer guys, because they're basically same way of operating. But what we are if you are expanding the IT guys to do new tasks without normally without their or out of their range, then we are talking about the meltdown, as I can understand, John. But that's my understanding. I don't know. You have to.
Well, with the IT guys, I find programmers suddenly taking on some development functions that they never took on before. So there's a little bit of shift, maybe more apparent in some areas than others. Anyway, John, we should turn it back to you. What do you?
Let me
Can I
make
make one comment? Sorry.
before we go.
Nancy, go ahead.
Yeah, and that is sort of the sociological perspective on this, which is that right now, at least I'll just speak for the United States, a young person getting out of college expects to start at a fundamental level in an organization and expects to rise and expects to move up. And that's how you get ahead. And that is your job, is to get ahead. And you do that by moving up in the organization. And it's so if there are no jobs, there's no there's no way to do that. And so and I'm all for what you're saying, John. I think it's right, but I just recognize the problem that causes people in terms of their own way of thinking and their own norms about how do I function in this world of work, and particularly this issue we have about the importance of getting ahead, of rising, of meeting your dream, of all that kind of thing that's just endemic within our society.
Well, John, it's back to you.
Thanks very much, Nancy, and everybody. Those are great questions. So we'll move on and let's hang on to those. I know we haven't really answered them yet, but what I'll do next is in a way walk you through the chapters of the book. And again, I'm going to move fairly quickly so that we can continue this really good discussion, which self-interestedly is probably the most valuable thing for me, is not to hear me talk. So I'm happy to clarify. But let me sort of relatively quickly move through some of these ideas. And this is a wordy slide, but we're going to kind of go row by row. Okay, and hopefully that'll make it a little easier to digest, and hopefully maybe you'll start formulating some other questions and observations along the way. This has been terrific so far. Okay, so let's take the top row. And I'm going to use one of my favorite examples here to illustrate the first two. So the first idea, the first element, let's call it in the book, it's actually a chapter, would be thinking of work as stable jobs, moving to thinking of work as deconstructed elements, tasks, projects, etc. And one of my favorite examples here is one of necessity from COVID. And so we have Providence Health, which is a large healthcare provider in the Northwest US mostly. And they have hundreds of hospitals, thousands of hospital workers that they cover. It's kind of a healthcare provider insurance organization, but they also run their hospitals. So here comes, we all knew there was a nursing shortage way before COVID. That nursing shortage, by the way, is always measured by the number of regular full-time nursing jobs that we will have in the future, the number of people who will get a regular 4-year nursing degree and be qualified for those jobs. And when you compare one to the other, that's how you get whether a shortage or a surplus. And in the US, they're estimating well over 1 million, maybe much more. And you can think of many occupations like this. Here comes COVID, and it makes it even worse. Now it's life or death. And there's simply not enough nurses. If you define your job as an HR leader or as a leader, well, we have these regular full-time nursing jobs that look like this gray box, and we have to find people that are fully qualified to fill them. You're done. There is not a chance that you can possibly get enough people with nursing degrees to fill jobs as they're usually described. So the people at Providence realized that it might be useful to take apart the pieces of this job. I've listed 6 of them: intubating patients, shift scheduling, taking temperatures, unresponsive patients, etc. All right, and so the second thing they had to do then was also then, if we're going to take apart the job of nurse, we also have to think about workers, not so much as a person ready to take on the full-time job of a nurse, but perhaps as someone who could do a part of that nursing job. And those two things together, they asked, would that help us redefine what we mean by a nursing shortage and maybe find a way to alleviate it? And so this is what they did. On the top, you have the traditional, this is a box, this is the ice cube. A person who is a nurse has to do all of these things. And they started to let them melt. And so this shows kind of where they melted into. So on the left side, you see what's called top of license nursing. And that's the work that nurses love to do. It's the work they're highly qualified for: intubating patients, diagnosing unresponsive patients, administering medication. All of those pieces of the box at the top need to flow to a person who looks a lot like the nurse that we had before. However, there's also this idea of taking the temperatures of relatively healthy patients, checking on stable patients. Well, it turns out that those things can be done by people that we might call receptionists or others in the hospital that were not doing that before. But we need to see those people that have the job of receptionist, which does not include taking temperatures or checking on patients, and we realize that they're qualified. They have a capability inside of them that is not shown in their job to do those things. And then I'll go to the right, scheduling. Nurses spent a lot of time scheduling shifts, et cetera, knowing that it was kind of a waste of time. Well, COVID was the opportunity for this organization to go out and buy the software that would allow that scheduling thing to happen in minutes or in an hour using AI and a little bit of nurse input. So we moved to automation, the scheduling shifts. All right, so now we've got our nurses on the left doing much more top of the line work. They're not doing what the receptionists did. But the problem is that we still have too much nursing work. Even with all of these changes, there's still a lot that needs to be done, more than the nurses can handle. So where could we find the capability to do the top of line nursing tasks? Well, we have these people called hospital administrators, and their job is chief financial officer, chief operating officer, chief executive officer. They have a job that looks a lot like an executive, but they're doctors. And in the past, they were licensed to do top of line things on the floor of the hospital. So Providence said, we're going to take that capability, which is not being used in your job, and we're going to have you go get relicensed, and we're going to move you onto the floor to do many of the things that nurses would do. So to me, it's kind of interesting. If an economist was now to try and calculate what is the nursing shortage or surplus, you look at that bottom, and you no longer have the easy job of just counting up the jobs and the degrees. You've got to now consider a lot of options that this hospital could use to melt the work, melt the people, and reconfigure them to meet this need. Okay, so that's sort of elements 1 and 2. Think about the work first, not a job, and think about the workers as an entire set of capabilities, some of which go outside their job, but could flow to where we need the work done. All right, so example number 3 or element number 3 would be we go from a stable system of jobs. The organizing system is jobs, employment contracts, specific reporting relationships, to an internal model where we're perpetually reinventing tasks and project combinations, and we might even reach outside of traditional employment for that. You've already talked about some of this work in the examples. We talk in the book about an insurance company, and they had cloud engineers. But in their traditional way, they had a job for a cloud engineer. They had cloud engineers for finance, cloud engineers for sales, cloud engineers for HR, and they had a job, and they were located in that function. Well, in this case, they took a look at that. They didn't have enough of them. They were not going to be able to hire enough of them. But if they put those cloud engineers into a pool rather than being in a job allocated to functions, then when finance had a slowdown in the need for IT or cloud work, but let's say HR or sales was ramping up, now the job is to flow across department lines to the where the work is. That means that the organization system now is that these digital engineers are reporting to let's say an oversight, maybe might call it a supervisor or a manager, but they're now reporting based on the projects they've done, not based on the functional job that they do in HR or finance, et cetera. So again, they still have jobs, these cloud engineers, but the job has now become being capable of flowing to all kinds of work. I think that's a good example where you would start to see cloud engineers and others taking on things from maybe we might say other disciplines, because that's what the work requires. Programmers becoming developers, cloud engineers becoming cybersecurity, and taking on individual skills, individual capabilities that might not normally be put into a job, because these projects really encourage them to go get additional qualifications, not a degree, and then come back, and with those qualifications, they can be allocated to more work than before. So this goes a little bit, I think, Nancy, to your idea of moving up the hierarchy. In a world of this kind of engineering, that upward movement is counted almost in capabilities, I think. And some of those capabilities might be things like supervision, organization, et cetera, but others of them might be outside discipline ones. So when you look at what someone does, they look more like a kind of combination of cloud and cybersecurity and programming plus development, and they might even be doing some supervision. And we don't ever try to coalesce that into a job necessarily, but everyone knows who's the better qualified and who has qualifications to do certain things. And they sort of move into the team based on that. And the next element is this idea of full-time employees inside an organization boundary. The contrast being we reach outside the organization for gig workers, contractors, et cetera. Someone had the example of engineers just not being able to have enough engineers to do the work. And the engineering leaders are well aware of these platforms where you have programmers, you have designers, you have experts in cybersecurity, and you can hire them with a credit card. So HR has a real conundrum sometimes, because maybe 30-40% of the work is being done in this shadow world of people who don't have jobs, but have contractor or other platform-like connections with the organization. One of my favorite examples, an old one now, was that pharmaceutical companies had a riddle to solve with regard to how the cure for the AIDS virus would geometrically fit and fold into the actual virus itself. And they reached out with that riddle to a community of people who already enjoyed playing a video game, basically, where they competed to see who could solve these complex folding problems and geometric shaping problems. And so that's an example of of breaking the work down, understanding that this biochemical issue, this biochemistry issue of solving the AIDS virus had one riddle in it that was a geometry riddle, and finding people who were good at geometry to solve it. We have an example in the book of a retail distribution center that, as they automated and as they tried to deal with labor shortages, one of the things they did for a while was to reach out to project workers and bring them into the distribution center really as contractors rather than people with a full-time job. Eventually, they offered those gigs to people in the retail store, and they could come over to the retail distribution center when the store was slow, and they could take on projects over there. So that idea of breaking down the work, looking at it as projects, et cetera. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. Work automation, we've talked a bit about that. Lots and lots of examples where automation does not neatly replace a job, but in fact, you end up with the people staying and then doing something very different. One of our favorite examples is automated oil rigs. You see this a lot in the North Sea. You see it also in Texas, et cetera. They call them fully automated. What that means is that robots are now essentially running the rig, and robots are repairing the rig. Whereas before, you had to have a crew of people to do all of that. Now, does that mean we don't have the people? No, but they're not on the rig. they're in a control center, looks like an air traffic control center. And they basically can now turn their attention to the rig that needs them the most. So your most expert repair people that used to be on one rig, and if that rig had a problem, they were available for it. But if another rig had a problem they'd be good for, too bad. You've got to use the team that's on that rig physically. Well, now by pulling them off the rig, you still have the people. They're still doing the work of managing the rig, of overseeing repairs, of creative work, of figuring out what needs to be done, and then directing robots to do it. So it's a bit, they're probably now 10, I think the estimate was 10 or 20 times as valuable as they were before, in part because they can move to where their work is best applied. And again, you can only see that pattern, I think, when you allow yourself to take apart the old job of a person on a rig doing repairs, doing operations, and say, what if those repairs are now automated? What is the remaining work to be done? And how does that work change at a task level? I'll talk now about management coordination, and I'll use an example of Unilever, which kind of brings a lot of these things together. We think of management coordination as hierarchical in the traditional system. I have these 5 people, they report to me because I know they have boxes and it's their job to report to me. They stay in those boxes, that's the work that they do. And there's these lines from the boxes to me, and I have a box. And my job is to have these people reporting to me, and in turn to direct them, develop them, et cetera. That's tradition. In the new system, you have a lot more projects floating around. The engineers, the cloud engineers are floating to projects. They're picking up qualifications. So their work and their work capability is changing, even if we don't change their job. And that means that managers are coordinating differently. In a project-based world, yes, you'll see the people that used to report to you, but you're also going to be sharing them with other leaders. And some of the work that you do is going to be posted as a project to a platform. And even inside the organization, somebody else's direct reports are going to come work for you on that project. And so the amount of times that leaders touch a worker through a project might be 10, 20, 50 times more rapid as they do these short-term projects, rather than, well, I'll see you when I move this person along and bring you into the job they held, maybe every year or two. Well, now I might see you 3 times in a year, even though you work for another leader. That leader's going to see my people. And so it really changes the nature of the coordination mechanism. And I think it creates a situation where leaders, the managers, are going to need to be much more consistent. They're going to need to be much more of a team, communicate better. There's going to need to be a consistent set of values, a sense of purpose, et cetera. And it's all going to be on display and revealed in maybe 10 or 20 times faster. So if you have a poor leader that no one wants to work for, that's going to show up really fast as people choose not to take projects with that leader. No longer can they be kind of a bad or mediocre leader and say, well, but it's your job to report to me. I've got you in this box. Well, you don't have them in that box anymore if they can take on a project, et cetera. One of the best examples that we've seen is Unilever. Sorry, I'll go back to this. And many of you may have seen these things. They're called internal talent marketplaces. It's a product that's put in place by Eightfold, Gloat, Degreed, Workday. And what is that product? Well, they come in and they create a platform and give access to a platform where managers with work to be done can break it down out of a job description and post those pieces as projects on the platform. Workers in your organization can see those projects and they can choose to take them on. They choose voluntarily, in addition to their regular job. I must say, I never expected very many people would take on voluntary work in their company that they're not paid for. It turns out massive numbers of people do. Unilever found thousands of what they call hidden hours as people saw projects that intrigued them, projects where they could showcase capabilities that weren't showcased in their job, groups they wanted to join, and they take on a project voluntarily that is voluntarily posted by a leader. In a world like that, The acceleration of leader-member exchanges, et cetera, the acceleration of team connections is going to mean that a lot of things get revealed, hopefully good things. If you've got a good leader, purpose-led leaders, if leaders get together and have a common purpose, you're going to see a lot of good things happen really quickly. If they don't, you're going to see a lot of bad things happen much more quickly. So it's really quite interesting how these new systems called internal talent marketplaces, even just for employees in the organization that keep their jobs, but pretty soon they start to look like someone way outside of the job. And in fact, at Unilever, they had one example where a person in finance was fascinated with diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, started taking on projects over there. And then, of course, the end of the story is the diversity, equity, and inclusion group hired the finance person to come over and take a job in their organization because of this project work that was done all voluntary and largely not directed by supervisors, largely directed by the platform, nudging people, saying, you know, if you did this project, you might like this one, that kind of thing. And then the final element, and then we'll turn to breakout to a discussion, is this idea of social values and policies. And one of the things you run into as you start writing about this is you realize that the full solution can't really happen if it's only the organizations where workers are engaged that's doing it. To really work, there needs to be a system where workers have the capability to move from organization to organization, have their capabilities recognized. So the World Economic Forum and my colleague Ravin Jesuthasan, co-author on the book, works a great deal with them, writes a lot about the idea of portable things like portable pensions, portable healthcare, voice and recognition being created by the platform, a transparency about how the platform works. All of those things accelerate the ability for this to happen, because once you start to do it internally and you allow things to melt and you look at capabilities, it's really just a click away that organizations say, wait a minute, why are we doing this individually? What if we had a common language of skills and capabilities and we could start to move our people out of our organization to another organization and then maybe even bring them back to do things that we can't offer them, to develop capabilities that we can't offer. But this kind of thing really, it can crash very quickly if, as in the US, most of the society is built on the idea that it's the job that is the holder of your social safety net. You know, you don't have a pension or retirement unless you have a job. You don't have health care unless you have a job, or union representation unless you have a job. And when politicians and very well-meaning, very smart politicians, policymakers, et cetera, economists, I wince when they say, let's create great jobs. Because I think as soon as they use the word job, they have limited their thinking about how work might evolve. I would much prefer that we substitute the word work instead of jobs in almost everything where we talk about. And how different would the policy discussions look if they started out saying we're going to create great work and an ecosystem where individuals can find and do the work that is best for them and best for society, et cetera. So let's abolish the idea of saying our policy is to create only great jobs and say jobs are just one way that we might create great work. Okay, that was a pretty whirlwind tour.
Yeah, John,
book.
can you just hold on
helpful.
this last slide for a second?
Of course,
John?
yeah.
I just want to mention something that maybe you just didn't refer to, but I think is part of the work that you and Ravi discovered in your research, which is this question of social values and policies as part of the framework is not only important externally, but also internally to the organization. I remember one particular concept that you and Ravi have spoken about or written about, which is in the old world, or even maybe mostly the current world, the social contract in organizations between the employer and the employee is to provide a secure job in return for loyalty.
Yeah.
Whereas in this system, the contract is to provide sustainable employment in return for loyalty, which means that the organization needs to support the continual development of the capability. It has policies to provide continual development of the capability, as opposed to security. I thought that was a very, very important point around social values and policies,
I think that's
particularly with
right.
gig workers.
Yeah, I think you're right, Bert. And as soon as you start to say it, I think we can. So I think, yes, the idea of we'll provide you with, we could say, sustainable employment. We do not know what the jobs are going to look like. We don't know what work you're going to do. We cannot tell you that this job is going to last for a long time, but we can tell you that our deal will be to look ahead together with you and provide a system where you can evolve and signals to help you evolve to the places where your work is going to be most needed. I absolutely agree. It's something more like that. Then I wince a little, not because of anything you said. However, I think we're just a click away from realizing that can't really be embodied in one organization. And you immediately have to say, we'll also commit to finding you work in another organization.
Exactly.
If that's where you can grow. And now what's the organization boundary? So now do we have an ecosystem of 5-10 partners that have now said, well, we're going to look at all of the work in all of our organizations, and we're going to create a system where people can kind of meander through that work often in unique ways that only one of us can offer them. Very interesting.
And this is part of the answer to your question, Nancy, about, career. Part of it. Anyway, I'm sorry, John. I just, that's such an important
thing.
Not at all.
Yeah, thank you.
I thought the social values and policies element of the framework is not only important externally, which it is.
Yeah.
It's also important internally as well.
Well, and I think even more in the leadership piece, and I'll go back to that, where I talked about, once you let a Unilever system work, you've suddenly got leaders faced with coordination issues, like how much do I let my people volunteer? I'm in the finance world, and I have this person passionate about diversity, equity, and belonging, and they say, I'm going to take this project, and I can still do my regular job and do this other project too. Well, how does that make a leader feel? Like, well, wait, I thought I gave you enough work. And wait a minute, I kind of might need you. And if you're over here working on this project, it's a very interesting moment, Bert, I think, where there's a whole set of value changes about the nature of what it means to oversee and to sort of manage workers in conjunction with now maybe lots of other managers that are also trying to manage those workers and share them and all that sort of thing. I think this really gets to the heart of a lot of the discussion in the world you all are experts in, I think, and I'd be interested in your views. That's really a socio-technical organization question, is how would we evolve the mindsets, the values, et cetera, so that people say, I feel security, I feel belonging, but it's a belonging to this ecosystem rather than security in a job or even one organization.
So, John, do you want to move to your questions, and we'll just,
here we go. Thank you.
We'll just open it up to everyone. So the first question being about organization and STS design elements that you think would support and capitalize on this new work system. So how can we really utilize our kind of perspective to help support people actually developing the benefits of this new work system?
When I came into the workforce, the main system for organizing jobs was the Hay compensation system. It was very rigid and structured, and the incentive was that people wanted more full-time employees working for them, because the more full-time employees you had working for you meant the more pay you got and the more power that you have. And so this is really the opposite almost of that maybe the reward for leaders is more making people available and developing people in response to needs, which is a totally different mindset for leaders, and it seems to me for the workers too.
Yeah.
Gloria, you put so many interesting comments in chat. Do you have anything to say to any of these questions that John's put out to share with us?
Right.
Gloria?
I was curious about what STS design element actually is about because it's my first time joining this work.
Okay.
Well, I can talk a little bit about systems perspective. I
All right,
think,
well, do that.
yeah. I have been working in global tech company for many years, and my experience is that the reason why the melting ice came so quickly for that environment is because of, I think, external markets are changing and customers' expectation has changed so rapidly. They pivot their requirements in a second, and then tech company needs to accommodate that imagination, their innovations, and all of the platforms and softwares and services that they deliver. So I think all these discussions that we had is largely driven by consumers' behavior as well as external disruption like COVID. And after COVID, I think what I experienced within the global tech organization is it became really chaotic. So the definition of the work that we talked about in the beginning of the steps is even harder to define one single unit of work because the boundaries of work in job description becomes very meaningless within the organization, where when we are going into the project, people need to keep shifting their roles and responsibility despite they have actually written job description. So what we are figuring out as an organization right now is really understanding then what's the talent of this new era. And we are figuring out that no matter what job you're hired for, we will look for someone who has learning agility, because without learning agility, if you cannot adapt to this new environment, which definitely you will be out of your written job scope that you're hired for. You are not meant to be in the organization and you cannot thrive and you'll be unhappy and then people leave. So there are a lot more emphasis happening right now within the organizations like this that has a lot of disruption at this point to bring someone who has an agile mindset. So it goes into the project level too, but they are also looking for some people who has those agile mentality to begin with, to stay agile as an organization. Yeah, so it is happening in many different forms, but I think as the world shifts with a lot of uncertainty, certainly it's going to be very difficult to define what is about, what is the boundary and how do we actually move into the stage of step-by-step operating system that John's mentioned in a very systematic way.
Yeah.
I didn't see that happening in my organization at least, but it has already happened through the disruption and their adjustment. But it is really real. Yeah, that's what I can say.
Okay. What about STS design? To follow up on Gloria's question and also John's question, I know I've got some answers to my thoughts anyway on this, but I want to hold off until all you very intelligent people contribute your thoughts on this. Trond or Pierre or Peter, Nancy, or I wish Don was on this call, but he is, but his mic's not working. Robert?
Just start out then. If you look at the social technical systems, it says, and basically it's about the social part, the human part, and the technology, and it's to try to get these together to fit together at the best. And then it's we may ask, for instance, if you look at the very best, listening to John, and this very agile, the total meltdown. It's just tasks left, and you have to run around. And then we may ask, what is the working environment for these people? Running around, meeting constantly new people all the time, having to cope, and so on. So this is about the social part. What is it for the humans left when we have this kind of systems? And what do we take some kind of we search for solutions that are to the best for both people and using the technology in a very good way. So that's it's about as well engaging in work. For instance, in improvement work with the setup of just running from task to task. Is that the way to improve work? Sometimes it may be, sometimes it not. So it's about setting up systems that's combining the human, the human interest and utilizing human in a good way, and as well using technology in a good way, moving these parts together. So it's about as well unionizing. It's about structures. It's about organizations fitting this together. Then we are deeply into the social technical issues.
Yeah.
So it's that's just one take.
Great.
Thank you, Trond.
Any other thoughts?
I wonder, let me see if I can reframe a little bit, Bert, because I think we've talked a lot about it and begun to recognize, and I really appreciate that. I love it, Gloria, this is real. And I'm struck by your idea that things get done, but it's kind of chaotic when it really hits in the tech world. I think Trond, you brought up some beautiful ideas about what is work and can one be engaged with work that is totally fluid. So that brings me to my question. I wonder if you would say, STS has some tools to offer. Like I'm wondering if we could say, well, John, if you were to expand your thinking to the organization level, let's call it, and you were to come to us as experts in these socio-technical systems, I wonder if you would say, here are some things that show promise, things that maybe tools or principles, something like that. Again, I'm reminded in the paper that you've got a copy of now, that notion of putting a P behind STS and saying, what about STS-platform? And how would the principles of STS apply in maybe a more platform-like world where people find a project on a platform, get assigned, et cetera? So my main question would be, is anything coming to mind where you might say, well, John, here's something you should know about? Because we here in STS actually have some things to offer at maybe a different level, a slightly larger level than the work. What do you think?
One of the things that Cal Pava taught us a couple decades ago was that knowledge work requires that we form discretionary coalitions. And what he meant by that was that you've in order to get a piece of work done, it's going to require that knowledge workers figure out who are the people that can help with that, and then form a coalition of people to be able to do that. And it sounds like that's the melting of the ice cube kind of thing, where we're really, there's got to be somebody that is thinking, here's the body of the work, here's the definition of it. Here are the people, the kinds of people, kinds of capabilities that people have to have. Now let's go recruit them and bring them together and let's get the work done as a team. But it's really, to a significant degree, self-organizing and self-directing, but it's to accomplish some end that somebody is seeing value in and is willing to pay for. But it's a different notion of how you organize work. It's not the HR department that's organizing. It's not really the bosses that are organizing. It's a couple knowledge workers coming together as a node in a network to be able to create the solution.
I think, Pete, what that exemplifies is one of the key design elements from STS is the principle of participative design, and the way STS design embodies the process of people themselves developing the organizational framework within which they work. I think another thing that shows up in your model is the principle of joint optimization, because the platforms that I've seen developed in this, I would say, very early days of the framework you're describing, are ones that are very customized according to the needs of the people associated with the work. Rather than sort of having just totally prescribed platform frameworks. So one of the key principles around STS is the idea of technological choice as well as organizational choice.
Interesting.
It does seem to me also that what many people get from their work is a sense of purpose, that they're doing something worthy, good, that's helpful, and so forth. I don't think that this without jobs works against that, but maybe you have to, but maybe purpose is the foundation on which you choose which job to move toward. Or the next. So I think purpose is important. I also think community is important in work. Now, most of us have community outside of work, but if you spend 8 hours a day doing something, those with whom you do it turn out to be incredibly important. And if there's this total fluidity, it reduces the possibility that I can build community. Community, it can't be too large, or else I can't maintain it, right? So I can't change my job move to a different project every month and feel like I still have a sense of community. So that's, I think, purpose, I think, is important. Community is important. I think autonomy is important, and certainly what you're talking about provides autonomy. And then I think mastery is another important thing, that I get better at what I am doing, that I know more, that I grow in this knowledge. So all of those, I think my sort of thinking is, how does this melting, these ice cubes, how does it support, or at least allow for, purpose and community and mastery and so forth?
Yeah.
It really poses some very interesting ideas about who's responsible for all that stuff. And you could say, in a sense, that all along, we as individuals have been responsible for these things of purpose, community, autonomy, and mastery, and managing that for ourselves. But we can also say that leaders in organizations have a responsibility for managing that. And is it a jointly held stewardship in this melting and reformulating organization, where we all have to keep an eye out on these issues of purpose, community, autonomy, and mastery, and associate ourselves with people that have a sense of those and an intention about those, as well as being sensitive to and intentional about it ourselves. So it becomes a shared responsibility to be able to create the network of relationships that provide the purpose, community, autonomy, and mastery.
Peter, it may also be that one of the responsibilities of those in the organizations is to create, is to allow the time to build community. But when new workers coming together, to be intentional. I'm thinking now, Pete, about that Hackman note that I sent you. When a new project starts, he intentionally builds community at that point. But
I think you're making a very, very important point, Nancy, because in my experience, community actually is more important in these kinds of organizations than in the traditional. And the same way, purpose is more the glue than it ever was before, or had to be before. So time needs to be spent on defining purpose, clarifying purpose, engaging purpose, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, I think it really does fall. I think that an insight here that I hadn't thought that much about, but that notion of shared responsibility, shared, it's almost even more than that, shared engagement. And there's a role for what used to be a manager or a supervisor, and there is always going to be a kind of oversight. My colleague, Jonathan Donner, who used to run development at Unilever for decades, that's how I met him. And then also at the London Healthcare Organization. He's the one that suggested that came up with the ideas that we eventually wrote an article about. And his first reaction to the book was, well, this is horribly mechanistic. Basically, you're going to come to work and the AI is going to say, well, work on this because that's the most valuable thing. And we've matched it to you. And then to the extreme, not even a month goes by, Nancy, but maybe even half a day goes by, and bing, it says, stop working on that. because we've optimized, and the best place for you is to move over to this task with these people, and you're just a pinball constantly being fed these projects that are sterile, and you don't meet, you're not really connecting with anyone for any length of time, etc. And he's the one that came back and said, John, I think in a practical sense, as I think about what makes this work, it is more human than the existing system, because you don't have the crutches anymore of saying, well, my humanity is that I treat the people who report to me well. Well, now that goes away, and you've got a whole community of workers that may flow in and out. So his conclusion too was that a sort of shared purpose that now needs to really be consistent and consistently understood across a whole array, a whole community of what we might call supervisors. Because as you move as a worker from supervisor to supervisor on these projects, you're going to expect to see some consistency in the way they approach purpose. What are we here for? How are we defining our contribution? What is your community and how are we building it? All that stuff Jonathan realized is more necessary as a glue to hold this together, not less. We don't remove supervision. We actually enhance it. We actually magnify it in a way, amplify it, but in a very different way. And with tools that I think, again, I would look to this group. I think most leaders have no framework or tool to think about this. Their default framework is to look at a chart and say, for now, these people report to me. And I'll know when that changes because someone will take on a new job. There really isn't a tool to say, how am I thinking about a flow of individuals through projects that exist in this larger community that I'm a part of now, of many of us that are trading workers and moving workers around. How do we get together and have a consistency of how we know when someone moves and when they don't? When do we share? When do we hold? How do we express the sort of mega purpose that's going on as people move between maybe all 10 of us as supervisors? To me, it's a really interesting idea. And I think it echoes some of the things that at least my recollection is that I've read in the STS world. About project-based organizations, about this idea of shared responsibility and ownership for things like purpose and community, and a shared understanding about the goals of the work that allows you to flow to, maybe it's AI driven, but it allows you to flow to where you can make your best contribution. I think it's probably a combination of, yes, artificial intelligence, watching what's needed, finding people who seem to have qualifications. All that stuff is terrifically now terrifically advanced, but there is a human element too. It's not just an AI saying do this. Yeah. Go ahead, Bert.
Yeah, I was going to say, John, what you're just saying, I think is part of an answer to Gloria's question. And Tron more or less said a similar thing, that without the human element, this organizational form becomes potentially quite exploitive and doesn't realize its maximum potential.
Absolutely.
Without the human element. And it is the social and the technical that makes this possible.
I agree. That's exactly it. Yeah, this thing can, it's like if you let AI learn how to speak, if you let AI learn how to be a social media contributor, and if it learns from social media, it will become the most rude and what shall I say, abusive teenager, because that's what it's learned. So it is quite possible in this system for it to become very exploitive. Lowest common denominator, who in the world will work for the cheapest? You're just a cog in a wheel. If you want this work, go get this skill. It can be very, very sterile and very exploitive, it seems to me, if the algorithms are allowed to run to optimize on only one thing, which might be cost and performance. I really agree with that. And I think the difference is the humanity and the socio-technical relationships that are going to be where we recreate that system to better optimize.
John, is there anything else? Go ahead, Nancy.
But that really has to be intentional, I think, because it doesn't happen on its own. What stays in my mind and has for a long time since the time of the VW admission scandal, right? And that I think about all those thousands of workers at VW and at the other companies as well that knew something bad was going on. I mean, they couldn't have been creating that without knowing it. And yet, my guess is to protect their jobs, they did not speak up. So this whole, I've written a couple of articles in which speaking up is in the title of the article. this whole issue of how do we make it safe in this new world we're talking about for people to speak up about things like that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, Nancy. And I'm not sure, I'm just speculating, right? One version of this would be that if the system really does develop, and it becomes kind of ubiquitous, and everyone knows that to the system, alternative work, would that empower workers essentially to say to a you don't need to tolerate this or to leave, to the point where the system requires that organizations work better, because people will just gravitate. They just gravitate away from Volkswagen into a place where they can speak up. And speaking up will become a known thing that this person does. This person is known to have the capability that they will speak up on things that are controversial and wrong. And that's now publicly known. Like let's take you. You're known to be that kind of a team member. And so you're going to gravitate to organizations and to communities and organizations that know that and that want you there. And you'll gravitate away from ones that don't, because they'll read that and say, oh, I don't want that, So it's really interesting to me, if this thing really gets going, you almost have, I've talked with Bert about this, the Amazon of work, or pick whatever platform, but you present yourself as a worker in the way that you might present a product to a market on Amazon. And the system, through the transactions, finds the people that you best fit optimally, in the same way that the Amazon algorithm will help find customers that are the best fit for your product. And if some of these things you're talking about, Nancy, ability to build a community, willing to whistleblow, those kinds of things, if those were known and the market started to value them, I mean, that could really be interesting, is watching where do the people who speak up go? Pretty fascinating to me, the kinds of data that might evolve from this if some of these capabilities were more public.
Well,
but
I hadn't thought of it as a capability. Thank you, John.
Oh, it definitely is. But think about it, right? I mean, what is the reason people value you, Nancy? I'm sure, and so many of you, is that sometimes you're called in. I often say to my clients, look, I get this. You're going to put me up in front of your CEO and they're going to hate what I say and I'll get fired, but we'll have said it, and that's what you hired me for, is I have the capability to say it and the willingness to get fired as a contractor. And that leaves you safe, to sort of take the echo of what I said and work with it, and I'm sure many of you do the same thing. So it is interesting. Yeah, to be honest, I had not thought of it until just now, that capabilities like telling the truth, whistleblowing, being willing to have controversial conversations, those kinds of things could become more public.
Mm-hmm.
We're close to our announced closing time, so I do want to respect.
Yeah, me too.
Is there anything else you want? I do want to make a couple of comments about the link of what John's presented to us to the meeting we're going to have in Austin, Texas, both virtually and face-to-face at the end of September. But John, anything else that you want to add? I think we've been kind of closing this as we've been pursuing the discussion.
I think so too. I've really enjoyed it. I hope everyone else has. And really, Bert, I don't have anything, I'm not, nothing really on my mind like, oh my goodness, we have to say that. I think this has been wonderful. Just so if you're curious, the rest of the slides are just conclusion ones, a reminder of the metaphor, a reminder that at the end of the day, I think all of us have a kind of obligation and hope to build really good frameworks so that leaders, in the same way that they have pretty good frameworks for managing a hierarchical organization, can we start to build them frameworks so that this doesn't look like chaos to them? And I think we can. I think we're starting to talk about some of those principles. So again,
just to
with
mention-
that, thank you. Go ahead, Bert.
Well, I want
Uh,
to thank you very, very much, John. I've read the book and we've discussed many times, but I found this stimulating experience just in itself.
Thank you.
I do want to say too that for those of you that are considering joining us in September, we are going to be studying one or more organizations like Morningstar, a food processing company, which actually applies a lot of what John's talking about internally. In terms of there not being real job holders, there are people with capabilities and how they self-organize to achieve their work in a very, very highly automated process. And we're going to look at some other situations that involve a very agile organization. So I encourage you to keep in touch with us as we plan forward for Austin. And in about a week's time, Thursday, June 30th, we have a very interesting follow-up to some of what John's been talking about, which is the concept of work crafting. That sort of an old colleague of John's on the way, Terry Griffiths, who now
that's going to be a good
University
one.
in Canada, is going to share with us on June the 30th. And the whole concept of work crafting really fits very well with this framework. What did you say, John?
I think so. I think traditionally work crafting has been something people did almost in secret.
Yeah.
In their job description, and people would make the job a little more like what it should be for them, but you couldn't violate the job description. And I think what Terry will talk about, and he's really terrific on this, COVID really accelerated and made more visible the idea that people were crafting their work in much, much more broad ways than before. And so I really like that. I think the whole work crafting discipline has a lot to say about the frameworks and about the evidence of how people respond to the opportunity to craft their own work. Yeah, Terry's terrific. I hope all of you will join her.
Okay, well, once again, thank you, John. Thank you very, very
Thank
much for
you.
doing this.
Thanks,
All right,
everyone.
everybody. I guess
Please
we're at
stay
a
in
closing
touch.
time.
Okay, thanks.
Bye
I'll
bye.
sign off now then. Thanks,
Bye, Tom.
everyone.
Bye, Pierre.
Bye-bye.
Bye.